Jinx is one of the most popular champions in the game right now. And for good reason. I mean, look at this. Jinx is an absolute menace in teamfights and can single-handedly carry games for you with her reset mechanics. And in this video, I will give you a complete overview on how to play Jinx in the current meta so you can get optimal results in your ranked games with her. Speaking of the meta, a very interesting trend you can see in the bot lane right now is the choice of summoner spells. Historically speaking, AD carries always picked either heal or exhaust. One of your summoner spells is obviously the ever so overpowered flash, but the other slot comes down to your personal preference. Heal allows you to play a stronger lane phase, since it is the best spell for early 2v2 fights in the bot lane. Exhaust is less valuable in lane in most matchups, but the trade-off is that it completely shuts down assassins in the late game, who, without exhaust, would just one-shot you. However, high elo Jinx players these days take neither. They forego the early power of heal and the late game safety of exhaust, and instead they take ghost. Actually, many AD carry mains started following this trend, since kiting with movement speed is a core marksman mechanic, and the more movement speed you have, the easier it is to do. But on Jinx, this new summoner spell is especially strong. She is one of the best team fighters in the game due to her passive, which already gives you a very clear-cut and straightforward game plan. You want to be grouped with your team and then start cleaning up in teamfights front to back as soon as your passive goes off. Well, you might argue that Ghost is then superfluous on Jinx because it is almost the same thing as your passive, and because you already have this passive, you might as well take another spell to patch your weaknesses instead. But this is not how League of Legends works. You never want to try and compensate for your shortcomings, but instead you want to amplify your strengths as much as possible. There is a reason why marksmen who are known to be squishy don't just stack tank items to counter that weakness, but instead buy offensive items to deal even more damage. The same reason why tanks who commonly are lacking in terms of DPS do not buy damage items to compensate, but instead fully commit to their tankiness by buying even more armor and magic resist. By the way, also the same reason why junglers want to ignore their team's losing lanes and instead snowball their team's winning lanes. Yeah, this might be tilting for some, but it is how you win your games. Anyway, Jinx is the kiting champion par excellence, and Ghost just takes that to the next level. Of course, without heal you are forced to play a little more safe during the lane phase, but Jinx's biggest power spike is not the early game, but rather the mid game when she reaches level 9. Level 9 is crucial because here you max out Jinx's Q spell, whose bonus attack range depends on its skill points. Attack range and movement speed are effectively two sides of the same coin, as both allow you to kite more safely and make you harder to avoid for the enemy. And these stats tend to scale with each other really well for that reason. A champion with high attack range but low movement speed is still quite vulnerable, as they lack defensive options when the enemy runs at them. Low attack range plus high movement speed, however, is quite safe, but tends to have problems closing the gap since the enemy can preemptively move away. However, when you have both, you just dominate in every way. But no matter what, you must never make the mistake of ignoring the fundamentally volatile nature of League of Legends just because you try to follow a game plan. Even during the early game, Jinx's rockets have more range than most champions, so if the junglers set up a huge fight in the bot lane, the rocket form ghost combo is already extremely deadly. Movement speed is an inherently defensive stat, so Jinx, being the juiciest target, popped Ghost instantly as soon as Lee Sin joined the fight. This way she avoided his skill shots while then also being able to stay in range to attack whomever her allies were attacking. Of course, an early lead is nice, but you must not throw it away by getting ahead of yourself. Stick to Jinx's game plan and safely farm for your power spikes. You only deviate from this when you get a good reason to. For example, when the enemy makes foolish mistakes that allow you to hit them for free, or when your jungler sets up a promising gank for you. By the way, keep in mind that if you want to have educational League content like this in your personal feed, all you need to do is click the subscribe button. In most games you will reach your level 9 power spike roughly when lane phase comes to a close, which of course suits Jinx very nicely because this is the time where you start grouping with your team. Jinx is also one of the better users of the reliable push past river roam strategy used by many marksman champions, as her wave clear with AoE rockets is quite strong. The less time you need to deal with the wave, the less vulnerable you are, and the more time you'll have left to look for situations in which you can help your allies. In this case right here, the enemy tries to set up a nasty Rift Herald siege against Jinx's team, but not being busy with the wave, Jinx can stay as safe as she needs to. Pay special attention to how Ghost is used here to deal with the opponent's assassination attempts. As Benjamin Franklin once famously said, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Despite not having the point-and-click value from Exhaust, Ghost allows Jinx to completely avoid enemies who rely on movement speed themselves or on skill shots. But while Ghost is strong defensively, on Jinx it is even stronger offensively. Without it, you always have to be in perfect position to both attack your primary target while also not overcommitting in order to get your passive going. Ghost, however, can be used as a setup, so you're able to trigger your passive in the first place. Even if you're far away from the fight, you can use Ghost right away to join, so you can snowball with the reset mechanic. Jhin for sure would have survived, but Ghost enabled Jinx's first takedown, both resetting Ghost's duration while also triggering your passive. All this movement speed coupled with Jinx's massive range means there is no escape for the enemy here. And generally speaking, the later the game goes, the easier it is to play these teamfights with Jinx. At a certain point, you don't really need to worry anymore about whom you are attacking, since even the tankiest frontline champions cannot survive your attacks for long when you got all your late game items. You just stay in rocket form so you hit them from so far away that they cannot do anything back to you. Or in other words, you simply play teamfights front to back and then let your passive carry you. And again, there is no escape. Your optimal rune page with Jinx is Lethal Tempo, Presence of Mind, Legend Bloodline and Coup de Grace with Absolute Focus and Gathering Storm secondary. Lethal Tempo is just perfect for this champion. Jinx gets all the benefits any other crit marksman would get, as the attack speed amplifies your DPS from the attack damage and crit items you buy. But on top of that, Jinx's massive range in rocket form allows you to stack this rune safely and reliably, while the added range on full stacks on top of your rocket's range makes it even harder for the enemy to escape. Again, you always want to amplify your strengths, and Lethal Tempo does that for Jinx just perfectly. Presence of Mind is a must-have as well, because your rocket form auto attacks cost mana. Being forced to play with your close-range minigun in teamfights would be a disaster for Jinx, but with Presence of Mind you'll always have enough mana left whenever your passive triggers. Legend Bloodline gives you some much-needed lifesteal, so you are not forced to get that from your item build. Coup de Grace is guaranteed value, but if you already see in Champ Select that you'll have to play against health-stacking tanks, Cutdown is also viable. Absolute Focus and Gathering Storm are the most aggressive late-game runes you can have, since all your crit and attack speed from items gives you even more value from the additional attack damage. Speaking of items, Jinx really likes the core of Berserker's Greaves, Kraken Slayer and Infinity Edge. Your range and movement speed are your defensive backbone, so you can fully commit to maximizing your DPS with your core items. There is an interesting alternative to Kraken Slayer in Gale Force, but this will only be worth it if you can get good value out of Gale Force's active effect. Kraken Slayer on the other hand is guaranteed value, since you will be auto-attacking a lot and therefore trigger its true damage a lot. Especially new Jinx players should stick to Kraken because it is easier to use, but even most challenger players, who all know how to use Gale Force well, are sticking to Kraken Slayer at the moment. The item is just that good. After your core build, you do have some real options though. In the example build on the screen, I've maximized Jinx's DPS for you with Phantom Dancer, Lord Doms and Bloodthirster. Phantom Dancer has the highest DPS and movement speed out of all Zeal items, and Jinx cares about these stats a lot. A funny idea, however, is running Rapid Fire Cannon for the occasional super long-ranged Q missiles, or even Runan's Hurricane to hit multiple targets with your rocket auto attacks, which by themselves already deal AoE damage. But Phantom Dancer's movement speed and single target damage is the most consistent option, so I recommend it. A Last Whisper item in the late game is always necessary to deal with frontline champions, and here the choice between Lord Doms or Mortal Reminder entirely depends on the matchup. But don't worry, it is very straightforward. If they have champions who rely on healing, just be safe and take Mortal Reminder. For your last slot, Bloodthirster is the perfect mix of damage and safety, but other defensive items like Guardian Angel or even more of Mimosius would work too if you're in the right matchup for them. In any case, the late game is relatively easy for Jinx no matter what, which means the best way for you to improve as a Jinx player is to improve your lane phase. A strong late game doesn't mean anything if you cannot reliably reach it. But if you want to get better, you can simply watch my AD Carry lane phase guide by clicking the link on your screen right there.